if we buy into your thesis that this is a new form of government, you had a wonderful way of saying it, this carving up the surface of our planet into little squares and giving them different flags is probably not going to be the last way if we stick around, way we organize ourselves. So there's probably something coming, right? And this might be it. Who lives in the cloud?
If we have the consumers who are the cattle at the bottom who are being farmed, and they're not really, conscious of what's going on, so they can't really do much about it. You have the peasants who are trying to rebel and resist. Gig workers are staging a lot of protests, and I've studied with my colleague Alex Wood. We've studied organizing and protest by online gig workers, but they lack the kind of power and resources to really, at least so far, to make a huge impact on the platform aristocrats' policies. But then you have the middle class, so people who've grown prosperous thanks to the opportunities that these platforms have provided. So that's the successful app developers, the successful online freelancers, the influencers, the online merchants of hit products. Anyone, OnlyFans models that make money and strike it wealthy. They are now much more powerful, and they have an interest, actually, in having a voice in how those rules are being made, because otherwise they might be deprived of all that they have achieved in an instance by an announcement from the platform.
Welcome to Melia Cred Conversations with Elvis. I'm Elvis Melia. At Melia Cred, we provide consultancy and research for economic development. And in this series of conversations, I hope to speak with academics, policymakers, workers, educators, consultants, executives of companies about the broad topic of whether or not the internet is actually opening up global labor markets, whether or not young people from the global south can have more access to opportunities to work and better access to opportunities to work than before. And what online labor platforms, what global business services are doing in this space. Can you be a coder who exports their services from sub-Saharan Africa, say, to the United States and grow a career out of that more so than in the past? What are the pitfalls? What are the pros and cons of this global digital labor market? And is it even a global digital labor market? And is it helping us overcome boundaries? And I couldn't think of a better person to start us off with that topic than Vili Lehdonvirta, who is the professor of economic sociology and digital social research at the Oxford Internet Institute, part of the University of Oxford. Vili wrote this book, Cloud Empires: How Digital Platforms Are Overtaking the State and How We Can Regain Control. We speak about the book and a few other things for about 2 hours. At some point throughout the conversation, I realized that I had not actually pressed record for the lavalier mics, so the audio quality in the first hour of our conversation is not as good as it then later becomes. There's also a bit of disturbance within the first 10 minutes from outside, but that gets better as we then close the windows. Substantively, we build up to the crux of his argument within the last half hour of our conversation. Until then, it's mostly stories of protagonists. The same way he wrote the chapters in the book is the way we're setting up this conversation. So if you only have half an hour to listen to us, please skip to the last half hour. The audio quality is better, and we will be closer to the core of his argument in the book, which is, as you'll see, I find quite fascinating. With that, I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Here is Vili Lehdonvirta. Vili, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
And thank you for writing this book. I start with a story. I didn't get it. You sent me the prospectus, and even, I think, the first time kind of reading through the book, you are making a big claim in this book. To be honest, what I thought you were saying was there's these platforms and they're taking over some state functions. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that's nice. That's a nice point.
Yeah, and some people are saying that too. Yeah.
Right. But that's not what you're saying.
That's right.
You're saying something else. You're saying something fundamental, we're witnessing something now. We might be witnessing the beginning of something really new. What is that?
So it's essentially the birth of an alternative to states as a framework for economic activity. So cloud empires, kinds of institutional environments online where people can trade and engage in business that are similar to states in that they provide protection for property rights and contract enforcement, but the jurisdiction is not territorial. It's transnational and it's personal. It's based on membership rather than location.
You have a background in programming.
That's right. Yeah, I was a software developer 20 years ago. I was always like a bedroom coder, as a kid. And then when the dot-com boom started and IT firms basically recruited anyone with even rudimentary coding skills, and that included me. So I worked at a dot-com for a while. And then I was, we thought our code is changing the world, and we were all very wealthy on paper because we had stock options, and the stock price of our dot-com was going through the roof. But then the dot-com bubble burst, and suddenly, we weren't so wealthy anymore, and actually our code got turned off, and I learned that it's not just code and technology influencing society and the economy, but the other way around as well. That social and economic forces influence the development of and direction of technologies. And that's sort of then how I, after various steps, ended up doing a PhD in economic sociology and starting on this academic career.
One thing that I found intriguing is that it's very accessible. I almost felt too accessible. Mm-hmm. At times I felt...
You're a specialist in this area.
Well, at times I felt, do we need a professor to help us with these journalistic stories? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And about halfway through each chapter, I felt, yes, we do.
That's right.
Right.
Because that's when the science comes in.
Exactly. And you're showing that it's not about evil people. These were, most of them, some of them were pretty interesting characters, but most of them are good-hearted, good-natured people trying to do good things, and we're just a bit naive.
Right. So exactly. So if we take, for instance, Pierre Remediar, right, founder of eBay, which is basically one of the most important platforms in terms of pioneering the business model of a two-sided marketplace, and this in eBay's case for goods. So he's an immigrant in the US, right? And he works in Silicon Valley, and he's seen how insiders profit and how kind of uneven access to information is helping to maintain these sort of inequalities and so on. And he thinks like, well, shouldn't the internet as a global instant information network be able to level the playing field, right? And he wants to create a marketplace where everyone can trade on equal terms and everyone has access to the same information, right? So he's got these, sure, he self-identifies as a libertarian, and he's got his political views, but basically he's very sincere about wanting to empower the underdog and open up opportunities for people who are outsiders, like his own immigrant experience. And he's seen that markets can sometimes do that markets can extend opportunities to people who are excluded from sort of traditional hierarchies and so on. And he thinks, well, shouldn't we be able to use the internet to really sort of supercharge this and create this global level playing field and so on, right? And so I think he had really sincere intentions. But then every step along the way when he creates eBay, right? And initially it's really sort of open and communal. There's no moderation, there's no administration. It's based on people kind of giving feedback on each other and just sort of order emerging from the bottom up, ground up, and so on. But then as it grows and all kinds of problems start cropping up, right? Like people selling fake diet pills, or people starting to sell fake this or fake that, or somebody just being really flaky and not delivering. What happens is that this informal order breaks down, and people start emailing him as the owner of the site. Hey, you got to do something about this. There's like all these scams going on. I just lost my money. You got to do something about it, right? And reluctantly, then every step of the way, he's kind of forced into adding some bit more controls. Okay, you have to actually register. Like, can you imagine at that time in the 90s, you could still use the web without even without having a user account. You could just start sort of bidding on things and posting items for sale without having a user account. And he says, well, can you please register a user account so we can keep track of who's who, and then if somebody is committing all these scams, then we can kind of deactivate their account. And so he starts adding these controls little by little, one by one, until eventually he finds that he's kind of created this, I don't know to what extent he actually recognizes it, but essentially he's created this monster, which is exactly what he was trying to make obsolete, which is this giant opaque hierarchy that actually restricts information to some market participants and gives it to some others, all in the name of maintaining order and creating a thriving marketplace, because he was very successful at that, right? He was really successful at creating a thriving marketplace, but at the expense of having to compromise on all those original values of equal access and so on. So I find Pyramidea as a sort of tragic hero in those. And this same story repeats again and again. A sincere technologist thinks, I'm going to use technology and code to change the world, starts doing it, reality hits back, and they kind of do the thing which technologists do, move fast, break things, experiment, A/B test and whatnot. And then at the end, what emerges through this iterative development, you've actually just rediscovered and re-implemented the very thing you were trying to circumvent, right?
Right. And the fact that they're trying to circumvent that thing, I think, is a fundamental misunderstanding of what governance is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, at the heart of it, I think there's this ancient problem of political science, right? That authorities, they protect us, but who will protect us from the authorities, right? So the cyber-libertarian viewpoint is that we'll create this alternative online economy where there is no authority, and therefore nobody to abuse that authority. But what they forget is the other side of the equation, which is that authority is actually, turns out, necessary, or we haven't found a way to maintain markets at scale without authority. This informal order breaks down. Historically, every time it breaks down after it grows to a certain community, grows beyond a certain size, a social order based just on personal reputation and ethics and reciprocity breaks down, and the only way if it is to be maintained is through some kind of authority, third-party authority stepping in and says, right, we're going to enforce rules, we're going to enforce contracts, we're going to enforce property rights, and they sort of the cyber-libertarian viewpoint forgets this side of the coin, right? And then the projects, some projects, some marketplaces that stay true to the original vision of let's get rid of all authority, they remain in the margins. They can't scale up. They exist, but they're not influential in terms of bringing work or opportunities to millions of people like eBay then did in the end. And then the ones that succeed, like eBay, in scaling up, they end up essentially reproducing this sort of state-like form of authority that they were critiquing in the first place.
Right.
And maybe this is all very abstract, right? So, I mean, it's from the point of view of people then who are using these markets and benefiting from them. Maybe it's useful to consider just some of the real stories and real people. Like in the 90s, there were a lot of people who were buying and selling things online in small communities, right? I bought some games directly from the suppliers, the developers at that time. There was no eBay or Amazon or Steam, or Apple App Store where you buy games today. So this was a thing, this sort of almost like an anarchic online economy. But as the internet then started growing, from early 90s, just a few million active users at first, to adding hundreds of millions of people every year, those electronic communities, they grew from communities into boom towns and eventually into this big giant online suburb where people don't know each other anymore. And if you don't know each other, then order based just on social norms breaks down. And it has done so again and again in history.
So by social norms, you mean this Axel brought this beautiful idea of tit for tat, right? Like this, even like Dale Carnegie, kind of like a guide for psychopaths to be nice, right? I always kind of felt that it's nice to live, it's how you can justify to be nice to others because it's actually in the end going to get you ahead. Now I'm thinking, okay, yeah, in a village.
Yeah.
But in a city,
yeah, that's right.
Not only that, right? There needs to be something else.
That's right. It's probably not a successful strategy. So Robert Axelrod, just to kind of break that down for anyone who's not familiar, he ran this famous sort of AI tournament, right, back in the 80s, where the idea was bots playing prisoner's dilemma against each other, right? And he invited computer scientists, mathematicians, sociologists, economists, political science to send in different strategies, programs for trying to win a tournament of repeated prisoner's dilemma. And then it turns out that the strategy that won was the simplest, almost the simplest one, which was called tit for tat, which is that the bot just does to you whatever you did to them in the previous round, right? So if you were nice to them, if you collaborated in the previous round, they will do so too. If you defected, if you scammed, they will scam you. And it was nice, which means that on the first round, when it didn't yet know your character, it had no experience, it assumed that you were going to be collaborative. So it would never defect on a stranger. It would assume the best of a stranger. And this is obviously like a wonderful moral sort of code to live by. It's essentially the golden rule that we find in all the great religions. And do unto others as you would have them do to yourself. And what Axelrod's tournament showed, that this strategy, it actually also won against all these much more sort of selfish, cunning strategies that were designed somehow to get ahead and get an advantage over the other party. But there just wasn't any way to beat it, because if you provoke it by defecting on it, it'll defect on you, and then you just end up in this mutually destructive cycle of not cooperating, and then doesn't win you any points in prisoner's dilemma or in the real world, right? And what wins you points in the real world is actually the ability to form and maintain collaborative relationships with people over long term. And tit for tat was able to do that from the get-go because it assumed the best of people. And so it won the whole tournament. And so then it showed that following the golden rule and being nice and reciprocal was not just a wonderful moral norm to aspire to, but under certain circumstances, it's actually the selfishly rational thing to do, right? That was the crazy thing. And so we find this in practice then working in places like some, village, rural communities where people, they all know each other, they repeatedly interact with each other. Of course, they're going to cooperate with each other, because if you start being opportunistic and you don't reciprocate, someone does you a favor, you don't do a favor back, well, they're not going to help you again, ever, right? And this is the community
and
that you're
tell others about it.
Sorry?
And they're going to tell others
right,
about
and
it.
then that's even without adding the idea of reputation, which is that, well, now this information circulates in the community, and now everyone else is going to start be wary about you as well. So under these circumstances, we don't actually need any sort of third-party authority like state to enforce people's contracts. Cooperation evolves spontaneously from the bottom up. This was Axelrod's point, right?
So to take this to the internet and to take it, I didn't want to spend much time here, but the most fascinating story, the craziest story is, of course, the chapter 4, Ross Ulbricht, Silk Road. I mean, this idea of many of these libertarians turning into autocrats, right?
Yeah.
Of these, and I hope we get to it, what these states, these empires actually are. But the craziest transformation, it was so crazy that on my way here, I thought, you know what, I'm not going to talk about this because Hollywood is going to pick this up. And then I Googled it, and they actually already did. I don't know if you know.
Have they now? Somebody's making
Yes, they've it's already out.
Is it?
It's called Silk Road, and I haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it either.
So it's there's a movie about it, and I hope it's nearly as good as the chapter, because the chapter is just so chilling, turning from what to what.
Yeah, so Ross Ulbricht, he starts out as he's interested in Eastern philosophy, right? And he's all about harmony and unity, and he's kind of disillusioned with kind of authority and state. He's also into drugs, which helps, I guess, with the to envision these harmonious forms of social life. And in that way, he's kind of continuing the tradition of Timothy Leary and sort of the 60s generation and sort of Summer of Love, thinking that we can, through consciousness altering subjects, we can maybe bring about a new social order in which we don't need authority and coercion. We can just do it all bottom up. But so he's kind of, he's in that mindset, right? But then kind of things, before he actually starts doing anything about it, he gets sort of radicalized into libertarian ideology a bit. He has experiences some misfortune in love. He goes to college and gets exposed to libertarian ideas there, and so he takes a little bit harder turn where it's not so much about unity and harmony, but more about kind of individual sovereignty and not being told top down what to do, right? And so he kind of gets a bit radicalized into these ideas, and he starts to figure out, maybe I can use technology to help bring about this revolution. Because he notices that, look, people have been talking about this for decades, and still, here we are in a nation-state-based system of social organization. So can't I use the internet to somehow kind of promote this transition from state to kind of a libertarian utopia? And he writes on LinkedIn that he wants to use economics as a means to kind of bring, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but sort of end coercion and bring about a social order based on individual liberty, right? So it's all about against coercion and for liberty. And then he launches Silk Road, a drug marketplace, which essentially the idea is, well, now anyone can, there's no government coercion, you can buy and sell whatever you want to, and this will help to kind of this will grow into a new economy outside state control and so on. But then very quickly he starts running into all kinds of problems as well, right? So people start scamming each other very quickly. Somebody does an exit scam where they trade, they sell drugs at really low prices, high quality, rack up quite great reviews, and then they take in a huge amount of orders, and it's pot day. They take the holiday, they take in a lot of orders, and then bang, they disappear with all the money and all the Bitcoin and all those orders left unfulfilled. So things like this start happening, right? So then he starts to put in place some controls, right? So he hires administrators to kind of watch over the participants a bit, adjudicate their disputes, puts in place some rules, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. And it sort of just escalates from there, right?
This is a libertarian who notices in real life he's becoming a scholar of statehood.
That's right, yeah. Right. He's discovering statecraft from the ground up,
Yeah.
But in the technologist way, which is a kind of solution-driven way, right? Okay, we have a problem, what's the solution, right?
Yeah.
And he comes up step by step, he develops these solutions, and every time, it starts to resemble more and more like he's running a government. And he even starts holding these state-of-the-road addresses, right? Modeled after American State of the Union addresses. And he I don't know, he doesn't kind of see the irony there, right? But then it gets even crazier because then people start extorting him, right? He's got some cybersecurity problems. And some information security problems. Somebody is starting to extort him, say, if you don't pay me $500,000 in Bitcoin, I am going to release the names and addresses of several thousand Silk Road users, right? And they're going to be in trouble because they're users of an illegal marketplace, right? And what does he do? He hires a hitman to actually take out, murder this person who is threatening him, right? And then something similar happens in here. Here is another kill, right? So it kind of he starts to use deadly violence as a means of protecting his reign and protecting his domain, and he justifies it to himself and to the person he's actually buying these murders from by saying, a person in from time to time, a person in my position has to do this.
Right. It's Animal Farm, right? It's exactly taking over the house, but acting as cruel, if not crueler. In this case, much crueler, because to me, I'm trying to understand the guy.
Yeah.
That in itself was a scam.
Yeah, so of course the irony then is it turns out he probably never managed to kill anyone. It was all an elaborate scam to extract more money out of him.
But it that doesn't make a difference in his intention.
His intention was to use deadly violence. He's trying to escape. Remember, he started from wanting to use economics to end coercion and allow and bring about a social order based on individual liberty, right? Fast forward just a few years, now he's trying to murder people in order to maintain his alternative social order. So he's going right from trying to end coercion into being an extremely coercive autocrat himself.
And what I found fascinating is that even in those murder for hires, there are levels. The first one you would say was a murder in self-defense, right? Someone was extorting him. The next, and then there was collateral damage. And as you know, we study, low-income countries, and a lot of things go on. In high-income countries too. If you look at Israel and the United States, what happens there in terms of anti-terror, right?
Right.
But in terms of his anti-terror strategy, there was no problem with collateral damage. Right? The guy was living with 3 other people.
Yeah, right. So when he's told, the hitman reports back and says, I've located this guy who was extorting you, is actually living with 3 other people. What does Ross Ulbricht say? I'll just kill them all. Right? So, and I think that's a wonderful framing it as an anti-terrorist, because from his point of view, okay, these are not terrorists that are trying to bring down his order, his empire, right? And now he's resorting to, and this is exactly right as he said, because it's almost like fate had planned it in such a way that it starts with almost like self-defense. He has to kill in self-defense, but then he's presented with like this continuum of morally more and more questionable situations until in the end he's just this murderous autocrat, basically.
What he does in the end is he goes after the exit day scammer, who just to send a message.
Yeah,
right.
To others, let's send a message to other scammers. You're gonna get killed.
Yes.
If you scam.
So that's where you go from killing in self-defense, if you can call it that, to killing preemptively from a harsh autocrat to a tyrant.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. Preemptively. Yeah.
Right. From a Randian libertarian who says we need to John Galt, we need to the entrepreneurs are going to make it happen. The state can't rule over us. To preemptively killing people in order to let everyone else know what the rules of this game are.
Yeah.
Right. So I'd love to spend until we get to. When we get to the main part, the part that I would like to...
Okay.
Democracy promotion, democracy assistance. I mean, that's the crux, that's the thing that blew my mind is we do democracy promotion in development aid, right? In development assistance. How much do you work with autocrats? I want to get there. But first, I want to talk to...
that's really fascinating.
First, I want to...
Because your experience here is super relevant.
It's a parallel. And it's at the same time in history, right? We're having this parallel.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah.
We're doing democracy promotion.
Right.
And you're taking that to these things that until now they were in front of my eyes, but I didn't even see they existed. Right? These empires.
Right.
Which we'll get to why we can make that claim, or you can make that claim that they're actually states. But first, I would love to let's take a few minutes on the death of distance, because I have you here. Yeah. I think a lot about what you write, and we kind of interact and so our field. I think a common dream at some point in the past has been the flat world, the idea that for people who have lots of time and lots of energy and lots of resources in the sense of wanting to work, but being not exploited at all, really just left out, not being able to enter the market.
Because your life chances, as you know, are largely determined by the accident of birth, where in the world you happen to be born, right? And which is kind of crazy. I'm extremely privileged to have been born in Finland, right? And so there's this thinking, can we not use technology to somehow even out those odds a little bit and give people more of a chance at an equal future, regardless of where they're born? That's in some ways the dream, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, someone opening a gate in a secondary city in a sub-Saharan African country once an hour. Can they not work on the side on their phone and do something, earn more money, and actually even grow a career, move into the creative economy, right? How fascinating would that be?
Yeah.
So there's two Greek guys.
Yeah.
They want to work together. One of them is in the United States. The other is in Greece.
Yeah.
Right? Karamanlakis and Tsatalos.
Yeah.
Tsatalos and Karamanlakis.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And they find a way to be able to show the one's employers or co-workers that it's fine to work together over long distance, and they then end up creating a platform. This
is early 2000s. It's not work from home, remote work is not a thing basically yet, and the company is in Silicon Valley, but one of the guys is in Greece and doesn't want to move to Silicon Valley. It might not even be possible. The work visas were tightly controlled and so on. So they figured, can't we use the internet to work together? Software developers. The product is all bits. It should be possible to work together over the internet, right? But turns out working together, it's not just a problem of information transfer, right? There's also, from an employer's perspective, the principal-agent problem of how do you make sure that your contractors are doing, are spending their time what they're being paid to do, right? And the established way of doing that 20 years ago. It was you put contractors into cubicles and then you watch over their shoulder what they're doing. Or you create a kind of office environment where people, so the social norm is that let's work.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be that sort of micromanagery. And so, you know, when these great guys, when they proposed to CEO, this one guy, he's going to work remotely. The CEO's like, I don't know, okay, I trust you, but and what would the other workers think? We're giving special privileges to somebody and they're not subjected to the same level of scrutiny and so on. So then being developers, they go away and develop a technical solution to this, which is a sort of remote co-working and monitoring suite of software that actually then makes it possible to solve this principal agent problem over distance. And next thing they do is, well, they realize actually we're going to spin this out and we're going to turn it into a company and offer this solution to other companies as well that might want to work with contractors remotely. And then they build a marketplace where you can find contractors, right? So the matching system where clients and contractors can sign up and then find each other and start projects together and then use their solution to actually do monitoring and billing. And also it ensures payment. It solves the principal agent problem also for the worker, in the sense that it guarantees payment because all the hours that have been billed and monitored, the platform guarantees payment for them. So it kind of solves the trust problem on both sides for working over distance. And today that platform is known as Upwork, right? So there was a merger and today it's known as Upwork. It's the leading online freelancing marketplace. It's a big thing. And so then, the question is, did this result in the death of distance? Yes and no. I mean, against the background, maybe to take a step back, people have been talking about how ICTs and the internet, how they will make distance irrelevant. The people have been talking about this for decades, right? And every time these hopes have been frustrated, the opposite has happened. ICTs have just, in some ways, been associated with even more urbanization and concentration of economic activity into small clusters like Silicon Valley. And so for a long time, kind of death of distance was thought to be a really sort of mistaken idea or a silly idea.
What it was more triumph of the city, right? So we had Saxenian showing how everybody is stacking themselves. Right. If you're a lawyer or a consultant, you need to be in those towers in Manhattan, right? That's if you are a techie, SAP, Germany's only big IT company has to have an office in Silicon Valley. Otherwise, they're not gonna. They need to be physically
agglomeration
present.
effect, in innovation spillover, all of that, access to job market, access to ideas, all of that, and that really happens in cities. And so, the opposite was happening from death of distance. The even greater emphasis on where you are as determining your chances in career and chances in life and chances as a business, if you're a small business, right, where you are. Because it goes the other way around as well, right? We were thinking death of distance could help SMEs, wherever they are in the world, to thrive and grow. They don't need to be in the city next to a big labor pool to grow. They can work over distance. But none of this happened, right, for decades, and it was the opposite. So then online labor platforms like Upwork came along, right? And then there's been tons of research, including ours, like, okay, well, to what extent are they actually solving this problem? To what extent are they actually allowing people to work remotely from wherever, and also SMEs and other companies to hire people regardless of where they're located? And I think, I would say that my synthesis of the whole literature is that, well, of course they're not eliminating the death of the tyranny of distance. They're not eliminating the tyranny of distance. It matters a great deal where you are, because things like educational institutions, where do you get those skills in the first place? You're not going to have the right skills to sell to the marketplace anyway. Or kind of being a culture to the right sort of tech culture that allows you to sell yourself to clients and so on. So sure, it doesn't completely address this, but I'm actually kind of on the side that says, well, but it has done some things. Like, we have some people now, not everyone and millions of people, but we have some people now in really weird locations in rural South Africa or something like that, where there are no outsourcing companies or offices or universities, and they are doing they're earning decent incomes, doing quite nice careers, working remotely as freelancers or working remotely in China. Now, maybe they moved there from a city, maybe they originally picked up their skills working in a city and then they moved there. That's fine. I mean, it still, so it doesn't mean that you can necessarily sort of grow up and spend your entire life in a rural area and hope to work in tech. Probably not going to happen. But it does kind of alleviate a little bit of the urban-rural divide. If it's now becoming increasingly more feasible for people, once they have made their career, they've developed their networks, they've developed their skills, now they can move to a rural area and actually work remotely from there. And I think that's what we're seeing also now after the pandemic, with the development of Zoom and work from home and all of this technology. That's what's happening. So not total death of distance and overcoming tyranny of distance, but a little bit, for the first time, a little bit in that direction, right? So this is the my contribution to that particular narrative, right? So where are you in this? Look, I would like to hear from you. So I've just told you, there was this extreme pessimism about the idea of death of distance and how the tyranny of distance still prevails and so on. And now I'm saying we have technologies that have to an extent alleviated that a little bit, not a revolution maybe, but slight shift. What's your take? You're an expert on this field.
We both like Paul Collier's Future of Capitalism, right? And he has these booming metropolises versus the broken city, the broken secondary city, right? Yeah. So you can think of, I'm going to give you any examples. Everybody knows the cities, right? Yeah. I'm wondering, where does Nairobi fit into that, right? Nairobi is a booming metropolis. It is a physical agglomeration. And when you were speaking earlier about how once you've been in the cluster, once you've been to Oxford, once you've learned from the best teachers, you can go live out in your cottage and work from there, right? Yeah. You can be, once you've mastered it, right? Yeah. And that's what it's allowing. Again, it's the internet is helping. It's another version of the Matthew effect, because if we're looking at the demographic trend in sub-Saharan Africa, that's not what we need. We don't need more comfort for the elites, right? For them to be able to work from their cottage.
Mass youth unemployment.
Mass youth unemployment. Yeah. So we're trying to get these skills going. And the what I take from your literature is that, say, if we go to a new sub-Saharan African country where there's neither a BPO sector, nor online work, where do we want to put our limited resources? Yeah. I tell people, let's go for BPO, because that's where you can learn in a group, that cubicle atmosphere, which you won't have on online labor platforms, right? Once you're an IT specialist, you can work from rural America, and your work has shown that, right? But those are not the people we need to help in Africa, right? That's not the demographic we're looking for. We're looking for lowering the entry barriers to this kind of work to get young people into it. And then maybe in 10, 20 years, they can go online to work on online labor platforms. But right now, we're looking at brick and mortar. So that's kind of where I come out.
I think that's absolutely right. And also, you probably need to attract private sector investment into that location to build up that IT sector, right? And if it's just based on people working as freelancers from their homes, there's no capital investment going in there. There's nobody with an interest in expanding the sector. Whereas if you are bringing in actual, the branch of a large global BPO company sets up an office and hires 500 people to work at desks in rows and gives them some kind of a basic training. That's capital investment now coming into the area. Now, I'm not the expert on this at all, and I have, as you know, we have colleagues who've studied BPOs in Africa a lot more, but I believe from their research that this has not always worked as intended. And it's very difficult actually to build up a BPO sector.
So we have this liability of origins, right? So we have, if you have a national champion, again, what should you invest in? Getting a company into, and this is going very much down the road of what we're doing now. It's a bit. We'll come back to the book.
Yeah.
What should you be supporting? Should you be supporting a national champion? That's what a lot of people who've studied East Asian industrialization have been looking at. Or should you be looking at foreign direct investment? Should you be looking at companies that are doing it already in 60 other countries, and they're just going to go to a new location to do the same thing, and they have they bring in the toolkit with them, right? So that's kind of the road we're currently going down. Of course, that comes with you have this idea of companies moving, is a race to the bottom, right? Moving on, but along the way they're probably building up skills. So that's where I wanted to come back to one point that you made.
Maybe just to comment on that again. I'm really not a development expert, but of course, simultaneously, many of these countries they're also trying to undertake digitalization in the public and private sectors, right?
Yeah.
And for instance, in the East Asian experience, right, there was a fair bit of protectionism involved to protect the development of local industries, to do import substitution. And at the moment, I don't know if that's happening. So I'm just wondering if local IT industries could benefit from local government and private sector demand for digitalization. If more protectionist policies, which now seem to be coming back into favor in Europe as well, were to be allowed.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge, and it's a double-edged sword, of course.
Yeah.
How much do you, so the more you open up, the more knowledge transfer is going to happen.
Yeah.
What kind of knowledge transfer is that going to be? Is that going to be only in production capabilities? Right? Are you going to get faster at sewing T-shirts or doing a digital equivalent of labeling data?
Yeah.
Or is it going to be innovation capabilities? Is that lead firm in the value chain from the global north going to share with you their core business, right?
Yeah.
Or are they just going to outsource whatever they don't want to do?
And now this relates also to these debates about digital dependence and digital sovereignty, right? So if you've brought your public sector online, but by using, let's say, American tech, and now you're dependent on their licenses and their infrastructure, their cloud data centers to run your whole public sector. There's a new level of dependence there. If you do it locally, it's probably super hard, and the quality is hard to get that quality, right?
Yeah.
But if you were able to pull it off, not only would you be supporting the development of the local ICT sector, but also achieving a level of digital sovereignty. I don't know if it's realistic though.
The one thing that I wanted to get to is discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
We have, currently there's a lot of attention about to racism and racial discrimination. There's kind of a nice message there's a kind of a hopeful tone in one of your findings.
Yeah, with the caveat, I mean, it's two white guys talking about racism now, but there is this finding that and others have observed this too, that some of the starting point is that on digital marketplaces, including online labor platforms, you can observe discrimination on the basis of nationality. Now, you could probably, if we had the right measures, we'd probably observe discrimination on the basis of skin color and this kind of features. And I'm pretty sure that's there, but that's not what we have data on. We have data on nationality, and you can see, or rather, kind of location, right? And we can see that employers in the global north, they're basically
We're talking about demanders of services on an online labor platform.
that's right. So buyers, clients, SMEs, larger companies, and individual entrepreneurs who are buying services from people, software development, data entry, graphic, anything, through online labor platforms, they are actually penalizing people from global south countries, from lower and middle income countries, in terms of being more reluctant to give them jobs, and in terms of being reluctant to pay them the same amount that they would pay a contractor from, let's say, US or Europe.
On the face of it, you would think that's
And that's well, it is by definition discrimination. Now the question is, okay, so well, why is this happening? And sometimes in kind of labor economics or social science more generally, we sort of distinguish between two types of discrimination. And one is just this sort of racial animus or something like that, where you just, for whatever reason, you're not willing to work with somebody like that, somebody who you discriminate against, right? And therefore you pay them less, or you don't hire them, or whatever, right? And then you have another type of discrimination, which is called statistical discrimination, which is that you don't actually know about a group and their skills as much as you know about another group and their skills, or you think you know. And so what we observed, and so this uncertainty leads you to unwillingness to pay the same amount. And so what we observed was that people I'm just quoting some numbers off the top of my head, but US graphic designers on a labor platform, they were paid something like, I don't know, $20 an hour, right? And then you look at Indian graphic designers or Kenyan designers, and they were paid less than half of that, right? For similar kinds of work. But as time goes by, and these graphic designers, they accumulate information into their profiles, feedback from previous clients, and other basically measures, observational measures of their performance that then future prospective clients can look at. Their income grows, right? There's people with a longer track record, their income, the amount of money that they're able to ask from clients goes up. Okay, so far very logical. But the crucial bit is that it goes up faster for those people who were originally paid less, for those who were discriminated against. Right?
Because this liability of where they're from.
Right. So designers from US, as they get more evidence of their skills in their profile through work experience and feedback from previous clients, their income doesn't actually go up that much, right? Because the clients were already basically assuming them to be competent simply because they're from the US. Whereas designers from Kenya or India, their pay goes up more rapidly as they accumulate evidence in their profiles of their ability to actually deliver. And so that causes them to start to sort of catch up, not quite catch up, but sort of go, their income starts to kind of reach converge with the income of the American designers. And this suggests that actually, at least the significant part of this discrimination that they're facing is statistical discrimination. It's people assuming that on average, Kenyan designers, they're a bit of a mystery. We don't, as an American client, I don't really know what Kenyan designers, the country image is maybe not as good, so they're making assumptions based on the country image. And it's only when they're given evidence about the competence of that particular Kenyan they're working with that they realize, like, okay, well, all right, I am actually willing to pay more to this person. My original assumption based on a negative country image was wrong, and I'm willing to pay this person more. So what online labor platforms are able to do by providing a medium for all this information to exist, they're able to help overcome this statistical discrimination to an extent and help those incomes to converge to an extent. Now, they're not completely converging, right? So even if a Kenyan designer has a very, very long track record, they're still statistically, they're still not, it would take a huge amount of work for them to actually reach the same level as the kind of median American designer. So not quite there, but it's going in the right direction.
And along the way, the Kenyan is probably at some point moving to America.
This might happen, yeah.
So this is the Indian, I mean, you have the Indian, India's GDP per capita is about $2,000 per year, whereas China's GDP per capita is about $10,000 per year, right? So if you're looking at the China manufacturing-based growth versus the Indian, where you always think of the Bangalore model, right? You think, well, it's not as great. But then if you look at Silicon Valley, it's full of Indians.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I mean, in a good way. And I don't know, and this is another, in another sense, the Matthew effect, right? I mean, it's this tech really helping out the strongest become even stronger.
In a way, the hope was that if you think about Upwork's founders, Tsautalos and Gadaman Lakis, they wanted to stay put, right? Each in their own locations and still work together. Because if you have to move, you sever your links to your place of origin. You miss your friends, you miss your family. Your positive contribution is taken out of the local community, right? Brain drain, right? So in a way, the promise of a global online labor market was that people would simultaneously gain the benefits of kind of migration, only it was virtual migration, by being able to access higher paid opportunities elsewhere, but not have to pay the costs and also inflict costs on the local community of actually physically leaving the place, right? And this vision too, I mean, to some extent, maybe that is happening. And to some extent, what is happening also is, yes, when a firm identifies a really good contractor through this remote gig work, eventually they'll want to hire it just for themselves and either work remotely with them or transport them to where they're based. But now tightening visa policies in the US and at least during the Trump era, and to some extent Europe as well, mean that even if tech companies want to move people to where they are located, that's no longer even possible necessarily.
Right. And now we come back to the theme of the book.
Yeah.
Right. In the cloud, it's not also not that easy.
That's right. So the idea was, let's get rid of all the borders, right? The vision with online labor markets was, let's get rid of borders. Let's allow people to work together without setting any boundaries between them. And in the physical world, as we discussed, they've had some success in that, right? So you can actually work remotely with people across national boundaries, albeit that things like educational institutions and agglomeration effects, they still matter. The original idea of online labor platforms, the vision was, let's allow people to work together without any boundaries. Anyone in the world can work with anyone else, right? And as we know, in some way, to an extent, this vision succeeded in the physical world, that we're now able to actually work with people in, let's say Kenya and South Africa and so on. It's still not a flat world. There's still agglomeration effects in location of educational institutions and BPO sectors. That still matters for people actually having the right skills and and so on. But in terms of being able to access the market, to some extent it has worked. But sort of ironically, what has happened now is that in place of these physical borders, we now have the emergence of virtual borders. So what I mean by this is that Upwork, in order to try to manage the supply of labor in their platform, they have had to put in place essentially border checks and put in place kind of visa policies, similar to Canada or Australia, where only people with skills that are at that time in demand are permitted to enter this virtual labor market, and others are stopped at the virtual border, right? And they're doing this for good reasons, because at some point Upwork started. They had millions of contractors from all over the world joining them, and it was getting more and more competitive, and people were finding it harder and harder to actually win any gigs there, win any projects there, and that was starting to basically undermine their ability to attract and keep good freelancers, and undermining the freelancers' ability to actually make a career out of this sort of work. So it was kind of threatening to pull down the whole economy, or turn it into kind of a dirt poor, low wage, hyper competitive market where Upwork as a company makes its money by charging the workers and employers a kind of payroll tax, quote unquote. And the payroll tax on a dirt poor, hyper competitive labor market is lower. You can earn less from that than you can from a sort of higher wage, high value added market. So they realized that actually we can't just let this be a laissez-faire marketplace. We need to start implementing some labor policies and some, ironically, some immigration policies. So they started looking at which skills are in demand and which skills we have already too much of. And they put in place virtual border checks and started letting in only those people deemed valuable to the economy and excluding the rest. And the people who were excluded were, so desperate, many of them, to get in and have access to these opportunities that they resort to buying fake or Upwork identities and fake Mechanical Turk accounts and accounts to all of these online labor platforms on the black market, as if they were buying fake visas and fake passports to smuggle themselves into a labor market like Europe.
Yeah. So that's the fascinating point of, and that's our research also shows this. These fake, and these are expensive. I mean, no, actually, these fake visas, right? These accounts, buying them in Kenya, in Nigeria, and Ghana. So
how much do you pay in Nairobi for an account to get into Upwork? Depends on the account.
So it depends. So yeah, it depends on the account, and there's also other tricks that Nairobians do. For example, you apply with a different skill set than you then actually. But I'm sure this evolutionary battle between the platform and the workers has moved on. That's maybe 2 years old.
It's a cat and mouse game.
Right. So that's maybe
immigration control and immigrants trying to get in. Always a cat and mouse game. Yeah.
So as long as I've worked in this sector, one of the biggest aha moments in this book for me was at the end of this chapter, of the chapter 5, was this idea that, okay, you have this idea of a flat world, and borders are actually not a remnant of an older time.
That's right, yeah. They are a constitutive feature of modern institutions, right? So the fact that we have institutional boundaries which say who belongs under this system of rule and who doesn't, that's not just like a physical problem that we can overcome when we all move online, but that's actually a feature of how we maintain social order with modern institutions, because you need to have a clear idea of, okay, who is subject to this authority and who is not. And eventually the sort of people who are in there, they're going to, in order, for instance, not to push labor prices down, like in the case of Upwork, they're actually going to be in favor of starting to set up these virtual boundaries. So you have this re-emergence. We've escaped to some extent physical boundaries only to reinvent them in the virtual world. And all of these platforms, also platforms like Amazon or Apple App Store, who are providing opportunities for SMEs, they also do immigration control in terms of who are they willing to let into their platform as a supplier, and who gets access to the consumers within their virtual borders.
There's really, apart from Ulrich and maybe Bezos, there's really no villains in your story, and even them, they're more...
It's kind of like a misguided hero. Things end up terrible, but he had kind of good intentions in the beginning.
So what I love about the way you... And by the way, the book is short. And how did you do that? 230 pages, which half of which is pretty much biographical. So it's really half of 230. You're explaining to us that the world is fundamentally changing in half of 230 pages, because in the first half you need to bring us along to show us actually it's not about evil villains. It's not Darth Vader who's done this to us.
That's right.
These people are just people.
That's
and
right.
these are societal mechanisms that are happening at a different level. And that's where I always tie it into your background too, because I think we're either social scientists, and even there I think it's lucky that you're a sociologist, kind of overlooking the other like economics and political science a little bit, kind of dipping into them. Or we're tech people. So you have this kind of analogy that if you criticize the tech, you didn't understand it.
That's
right? Which would apply to me, right? I'm in awe of it and thinking, okay, well, some things aren't working right, but I can't explain it. But you're using your background to explain that, okay, these people were great in one sense, but really naive in another sense, which is fine. Let's help them move in the right direction, right?
Yeah, like they're human, right? So they're basically good people with human failures. Nobody's perfect, and I think the key word is empathy. So when I was writing the book, partly I was able to show empathy to kind of techies who ended up doing great things, but also sometimes terrible things. Partly because I had this kind of techie background myself, but partly I think it's actually because I finally got the sort of headspace to start working on this when I was in Tokyo in 2020 as a visiting professor at Hitotsubashi University. And I was meditating a lot, and I was going to this Zen dojo actually, also to meditate with some very old chaps. And it's an exercise in empathy, right, and compassion for fellow humans. And so trying to see the humanity in what these guys were trying to achieve, right, and what was driving them. And usually it's some very human, always it's some very human motivations and reasons. And then if they end up being misguided and things don't work out their way, well, that's also life, right? It happens to us. And the people like Ulbricht, who ended up doing kind of terrible things, if you look at their life story, you can usually see some kind of course we can't be kind of psychologist from a million-mile perspective. I never met the guy in my life, but you can see that some bad things happened to him also that altered his viewpoint and gave him a perspective on life and society that was misguided, that was wrong, and resulted in terrible things. But you can kind of see where it might have come from, right? And when you see that fundamental humanity, you understand that then in the end he can also probably rediscover kind of what is right and where he realized where he went wrong, and then he's redeemable in a way. Is what I'm saying. So I'm getting a bit sidetracked, but I think it was like a big theme for me when I was writing this. Like, let's show empathy to all the characters and understand where they're coming from, and let's see if we can't really empathize with them rather than just criticizing them, even when they do end up going wrong. And it's the same with me. I expect I will be criticized for mistakes I've made in this book, and I hope that those who do will treat me with empathy and try to understand what my original intention at least was.
Right. So before we get to that intention, the writing style for me is by the way, is this going to be an audiobook? Is this going to come out?
So if it sells, then I've been asked this numerous times, and I've asked this question to publisher, and the answer is always, if it sells, then it will be an audiobook.
Okay.
If it doesn't, they won't. So
Well,
please don't not buy the book on the basis that you'll buy it when it comes out in audio, because if you do so, then it might never come out in audio.
so you have to buy it in order to be able to
It's a
listen to it.
self-destructive prophecy.
Right. So I asked because it's such an accessible way of slowly bringing us into really from first principles unpacking what we actually know as social scientists and what can actually help for building these new empires in a humane way, because we don't have that much time, right?
That's right, yeah. It's also a guidebook for developers. It's a guidebook basically for people who want to create something great online, but also learn from the mistakes that were made in the past. And then what social science teaches us about, well, why did those previous designs not work out, and why did things turn out the opposite from what was intended, and then maybe avoid those pitfalls.
I was really thinking today about like people like Mark Zuckerberg who've had their hands full moving from move fast and break things. This morning I was thinking probably to crossing the river by feeling the stones, right? It's really, they know what they're up against now. I mean, these guys are now running empires, and let's go there. Let's go there. What are you're not saying they're just taking on certain features of states, right? You're saying this is a new form of government that is happening if we like it or not, and we may be able to still break it, but we may not even be able to. If we break this one, it'll pop up somewhere else, right? If we antitrust, if we treat these like the Rockefellers, why is it different than an oil company?
So, well, first let me say I think it is possible to kind of break them and destroy them, but I think that we would throw the baby out with the bathwater if we did that.
What's the baby?
So the baby is that these companies and platforms have enabled so much new economic activity. You know, there's these entire industries, like, you know, I'm from Helsinki, right? So app development, app games is a big industry in Helsinki. And this is enabled by Google's and Apple's marketplace. It didn't used to be there, right?
We had the European Union. So I have these two points that you kind of blew me away with.
Right.
One is on page 2.
Right. So by my calculation, these platforms are now resolving more disputes between people than all of the world's public courts put together. And that includes even like traffic violations in the US, which is a lot of disputes. And
so they're not just taking over some of the state's functions, right? We have economic institutions, we have political institutions, more dispute resolution than in the physical world.
Yeah.
Right? And then that trade, the second part that blew me away of what they actually did was they facilitated what the European community couldn't do.
Right. So for the longest time, we've had this problem in Europe where supposedly we have a digital single market. That's the political term for it. Digital single market where people can trade within the EU online without any barriers and transaction costs. But then in practice, if you look at the market, especially some time ago, online merchants in a given country, let's say Germany, they're mostly only willing to sell within Germany, right? And Finnish merchants, they only sell within Finland. And if you're a Finnish customer, you're trying to buy something from Germany, they say, sorry, we only ship to Germany. And it's kind of crazy because this is supposed to be not only the intranet where borders don't matter, but also the EU, which the whole point was to integrate these economies. And now instead of a unified online market, you just have 27 kind of national cyber malls, just exactly the opposite of what was supposed to happen. So then the EU Commission, and this was situation already 15 years ago, and then the EU Commission says, okay, well, we're going to do something about this. We're going to harmonize regulations to bring about this digital single market, like VAT and copyright and and consumer protection, and there's like a million different regulations and things that are causing these national kind of fractures in the digital market. And then the what's his name commission came and went, but there was one commission.
Barroso.
Yeah, Barroso worked on this, and they said, okay, we're going to fix this. At the end, they had to admit, well, we didn't quite get there yet. Then let the next commission give it a shot, and so on and so on. And meanwhile, while because there were a lot of, it was very difficult. For instance, a lot of contentious issues like intellectual property rights, where each member state has their own interests and their own interest groups and different industries lobbying different things. So kind of everyone recognized that the status quo is not great, but it was very difficult to find a way to move into a higher equilibrium. So meanwhile, while this all was happening, people in Silicon Valley, they were creating online platforms, right? Amazon, Jeff and Mackenzie Bezos, they launch Amazon. Apple and Google create their marketplaces. We have all these and Netflix shows up. All these marketplaces for digital and physical products, and Europeans start using them, right? Europeans start buying Italian leather on Amazon. They buy Finnish games on App Store, and so on and so on. So we now finally have a digital single market, but it was created in Silicon Valley. It was not created in Brussels.
Right.
And now the trouble is it's also regulated from Silicon Valley,
right,
because it's the companies that own and operate these platforms that now set the rules. And Brussels, because we missed as an EU, and I don't blame Brussels, it's very difficult, but because we missed the bus and somebody else implemented the digital single market for us, now we're not in control anymore, right? And now the conversation has shifted in the EU, right? From how do we enable a digital single market? No, that's not the conversation anymore, right? The conversation is how do we grab the reins from the people who actually did create the single market, right? So, Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, Fairness in Platform to Business regulation, and there's all these regulations coming up that are seeking to sort of almost like from a back driver's seat. If the platforms are kind of running the show, driving the digital single market, then EU policymakers in the back seat shouting at the driver what they need to do, right?
Right.
So we missed the opportunity to drive the bus ourselves. So now we're trying to shout instructions to the driver. That's where we're at the moment.
So that kind of brings us to the crux of okay, what to do. So there's this, okay, should we treat platforms as public utilities? Should we try to have cooperatives that take that innovation and just use it in a fairer way?
Yeah.
And those are kind of things that are out there. What I find should we go there for a minute, or should we go straight? Should we go straight to the thing that I find most interesting?
Well, I mean, we can. I'll briefly, I'll say the trouble with platform cooperatives, great. Trouble is how you going to scale up, right? Mm-hmm. We already have this massive institutional framework called, Amazon or Apple App Store. How are you going to attract people to your alternative, right? It's a great sort of utopian project, but it's going to remain in the margins. I'm interested in the mainstream, what the mass of people are using, and how do we actually democratize that, right? And so the kind of one prominent approach right now is competition policy, right? Antitrust. The idea that, well, these are companies and they ought to be held accountable to competition. Customers voting with their feet. If they abuse their customers, if they extract rents from the participants, then customers should be able to move to an alternative platform instead. But the problems, and this is kind of how we dealt with the Rockefellers, the Gilded Age, the Standard Oil. Break them down and make the bits compete against each other. And that works if the product is a commodity like oil. But the product that these platforms are providing is institutions. It's sets of rules, contract enforcement, protection of property rights. And
the libertarians who did not want to do that, that is now their product.
That is
right?
the product.
That is
right?
Yeah.
Because every time there was the market failure, they did a little technical fix, and now the product that they're selling is this mass of fixes, which actually, when you look at it, it looks like government, because it's like, okay, we're going to regulate, we're going to enforce contracts and so on, and so we're going to control entry, we're going to penalize scammers and so on. So that's the product, the institutional framework that the cyber libertarians developed is like this government in a box, like a digital government in a box. That's the product. And the trouble is, if I want to do business with you, we need to both follow the same sort of set of rules. So I cannot just unilaterally decide to move to an alternative set of rules, right? So even if, and this comes from network economics, even if everyone hates a given network, like let's say Amazon, everyone there hates it, and there's a one that they prefer available, the one they hate still wins, because each person individually trying to leave the platform faces a massive switching cost from losing access to their previous trading partners, from losing their reputation, losing their kind of name recognition, their context, their cultural know-how, how to work in that environment. So for that switch to be possible, everyone needs to coordinate the move and switch together. And to coordinate your actions, you need political institutions, you need collective decision-making institutions, not a market where people individually choose between alternatives. That works if it's oil. It doesn't work if it's an institutional framework. But actually, mechanisms of collective decision-making. And so, yeah, that's my kind of take on competition. So I think, there's important things that should and need to be done in terms of competition, or like a vertical breakdown.
So far we were talking horizontal, right?
So far we're talking horizontal.
Horizontal, tricky.
Yeah.
But vertical, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. It's a pretty clear case that you shouldn't allow you shouldn't allow a company that's making the rules to also be one of the players, because it's plain as day that they're going to abuse, and they do, right? So the day Spotify, for the longest time, was the most popular music app in Apple App Store, right? If you search for music in Apple App Store, number one hit, Spotify. Then Apple launches their own competing product, Apple Music. Next day, suddenly, Spotify is not the second search result. It's not even the third. It's the 23rd result, right? Behind 8 different Apple apps that have nothing to do with music, right? So Apple just blatantly used their control over the marketplace to bend the rules in a way that disappeared the competition. And this is called self-preferencing now in policy language, and there's language in the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act to kind of prohibit self-preferencing, but I think it's difficult to micromanage that in practice. It's simpler to just say, vertical. You have to break vertically. You're not, the same business is not going to be both setting the rules and competing against the rules. And for instance, India has been pushing in this direction in regulating Amazon. So in India, there's constraints on Amazon acting as a first-party seller on the marketplace, precisely because it's viewed that competition can never be fair when they're competing in an area that they themselves, in a domain that they themselves control. So vertical, good, but it's not going to solve, all these other problems, like platforms charging basically excessive fees, just charging in all the money, all the profits that companies in the platform make out as fees. All these platforms over the years, they've been steadily hiking up the fees. or various other abuses that they're able to engage in. And the other approach also developed in the Gilded Age is public utility regulation, right? So they used to know things like electricity networks, where you have network effects. And you say, okay, we're not even trying to impose competition because there's network effects. Instead, we're just going to reap the benefits of concentration, but ensure that this large concentrated network serves the interests, or its interests are aligned with the interests of its users, is not abusing its users, by closely regulating it, telling it what it's allowed to do and what it's not allowed to do. So typically, you'd set price caps, if it's an electricity utility, caps on what they're allowed to, some investment requirements, how much they need to invest into developing the network. Rules about sort of fair and equal access to everyone, so they can't act as gatekeepers and say, okay, you are allowed in, but you are not allowed in, and this sort of stuff. And so this is what the Digital Markets Act in EU now is going to do, is doing to an extent. So it says certain platforms which are big enough to be classed as gatekeepers, and there's a bunch of things that they are not allowed to do and that they must do. And this is essentially public utility regulation, saying, look, you're so big, you're basically public utilities at this point, so we're going to tell you what you can do and what you can't do. And this is great, but where it basically it fails in two ways. One is that these platforms are immensely complicated beasts compared even to an electric network. And I'm certain that there's going to be just so much litigation over, okay, are they now providing fair and equal access to this party, or are they just, because they can always come up with some excuse, or they're very good basically at circumventing this kind of broadly termed requirements. And the whole history of platform business is, how do you skirt regulations and comply, maybe in name only, but not. So it's going to be very difficult to get them to comply, I think, with the spirit of these regulations. And it's going to be involved a lot of litigation, and SMEs don't have the means to litigate against them. So I think this is one shortcoming. This problem with public utility regulation, that can you regulate in enough detail for it to be actually meaningful when you're talking about a complicated beast like an online platform. Basically, the way you solve that is you add more and more detailed regulations and rules up until the point that you've effectively nationalized the platform, right? You've effectively made the state run the platform, because now the managers don't have any leeway anymore. They basically have to, they're micromanaged by the state. This fixes the problem of how do you kind of align their interests with the interests of the people. But the trouble is, which people, right? We're talking about transnational platforms here. They operate in close to 200 countries. They connect people across all sorts of countries. Of course, there's more users and there's some concentration. It's not evenly spread across the world, but still, if you want to nationalize these platforms, which country is going to do the nationalizing? Because it might not be your own, right? All of the platforms essentially that we're using every day in Europe, they're headquartered in the US. So if someone is going to start nationalizing them, it's more likely to be US than Europe. And so next thing we realize in Europe and the rest of the world, we're actually doing our business in the kind of virtual State Department, US State Department territory.
Right.
And we're already kind of worried about the fact that US and China, to what extent are they using and can they use their advantage in technological platforms as a means to also extend state power across geographic and also legal boundaries, and by kind of saying, let's nationalize platforms as a solution to this problem. We're just going to exacerbate this issue. So, in my opinion, in the EU, we should actually be thinking, well, how do we make platforms less dependent on states and not more dependent on so, right? But then this leaves us with the original problems. Well, how do we then make them accountable to the people?
How do we make them accountable to the people, or how do we help them if we buy into your thesis that this is a new form of government? You had a wonderful way of saying it, this carving up the surface of our planet into little squares and giving them different flags is probably not going to be the last way if we stick around, way we organize ourselves. So there's probably something coming, right? And this might be it. Right. And that point was, again, back to the beginning, where I when it really dawned on me what you're actually saying. Yeah. They're not just taking over some functions of the states. They have, you would say, in many ways, superior market institutions. They have, by trial and error and a very rough way of where they should have been crossing the river by feeling the stones, they were trying to run ahead and break things, move fast and break things, and they've broken a lot. Yeah. And they're realizing now they've learned by doing, and that's how these libertarian have come to respect that politics is important. Yeah. And here's where I want to come to the difference between policy. The difference between politics, so legislation, and administration. Yeah. Right. So they ought, and we're not going to talk about Bitcoin. There are other places where you've done that better, but I'm not going to let you go without just quickly talking about the governance problem, which I think ties into this. Yeah, right? Sure. So Bitcoin's kind of blockchain's governance paradox, as I've called it, is the paradox basically that blockchain solves the problem of administration of rules, but as a technology, it does nothing about the creation of those rules, legislation, right? It leaves that part undefined, which has led to all these then conflicts in the sort of cryptocurrency world over hidden rule creation.
Yeah, because it means there's some opaque processes through which the rules get made. And in a way, the digital platforms like Amazon or Apple App Store, Upwork or something like that, they're also very good at administration. They're actually very good at administration. They're better than blockchain, much better than blockchain at administration. They're very good at administering things. And as for making the rules they apply when they administer, well, they're quite straightforward because they're autocracies where the rules are made top down, right?
And that's also why they're so good at administering, right? I mean, Tom Friedman a while back wrote an article about being China for a day would be great because you could just ban all plastic bags. We can't do that in the United States, right? Yeah. So I think in a way that we complain about the slowness of bureaucracy, but understanding politics means that the slowness of bureaucracy is actually a feature. It's actually what made the it's what you need. This slow evolution of being part of making the decision is what's going to. You need to include everyone. Yeah. Right.
This is a question of legitimacy.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So now people are starting to become aware of the fact that the internet was supposed to liberate us from large institutions and bring about this libertarian utopia. And now people are starting to realize, people who make a living in these cloud empires, whether as app developers or online merchants, they're starting to realize that no, actually I'm not living in a libertarian utopia. I have this autocrat, the platform autocrat, on top of me, who can at any moment change the rules and make my business unviable. And I have lots of stories like that in the book, right?
An announcement that you fear
Yeah, you any morning you open up your email, there will be an announcement from the platform saying that, well, we made a slight change to our policies, and the thing that you make your living out of is no longer allowed, right? And people live in that fear, and it happens to them, right? And this is starting to eat into the legitimacy of this form of economic and social organization. People are starting to say, like, who elected you to, to make all these rules? And so if you look at it from the perspective of these companies, I think it would be, in fact, in their interest to start opening up and bringing users into the picture, giving users a voice in the making of the rules. That could improve the quality of decision making, because now you're getting information from more diverse sources. That's one advantage of democracy. But crucially, it would also improve the legitimacy of that decision-making process and make them less likely to face basically rebellion, which is what the other alternative is.
Well, yeah, rebellion. I mean, and then what comes after the rebellion? Who lives in the cloud? So we have consumers. We all consume the cloud, right?
Yeah.
Then we've got what you kind of made that analogy with aristocrats.
Yeah.
That's
so at the top
Bezos
you've got there the platform princes.
Yes.
They live in Bezoses
and then we have not to
disparage.
disparage
but there are
anyone.
people who are put in a very deprived position. Amazon's data laborers and the most precarious delivery workers on gig platforms and underpaid moderators on social media. So people who are doing lots and lots of menial work, and these are just hundreds of thousands of people who are doing, probably millions of people by now, who are doing all this menial work that makes this platform economy run, but they're paid very little and they have very little power. So them, in my kind of analogy to medieval Europe, I've kind of equated or analogized them with the peasants, insofar as they really have been deprived of all power. But then there's there's one more layer between the peasant and the aristocrats, which started to emerge in the Middle Ages in Europe, because the aristocrats, they were starting to create markets, right? So they were starting to enforce contracts and protect property rights, and that led to the emergence of markets, and then artisans and merchants emerged. And those artisans and merchants, some of them, they prospered off the market, the opportunities that the market provided, and they became wealthy, and they became quite cultured, and they had the social capital. They knew popes and people like that, and they started pushing back against the power of the feudal lords, the aristocrats, the princes. And this way we have the emergence for the first time of these autonomous market towns ruled by burghers, by the middle class, rather than by an autocrat. And so in the same way in the platform economy, and again, this is just an analogy, it's not perfect, but if we have the consumers who are the cattle at the bottom who are being farmed, and they're not really, conscious of what's going on, so they can't really do much about it. You have the peasants who are trying to rebel and resist. Gig workers are staging a lot of protests, and I've studied with my colleague Alex Wood. We've studied organizing and protest by online gig workers, but they lack the kind of power and resources to really, at least so far, to make a huge impact on the platform aristocrats' policies. But then you have the middle class, so people who've grown prosperous thanks to the opportunities that these platforms have provided. So that's the successful app developers, the successful online freelancers, the influencers, the online merchants of hit products, anyone, OnlyFans models that make money and strike it wealthy. They are now much more powerful, and they have an interest, actually, in having a voice in how those rules are being made, because otherwise they might be deprived of all that they have achieved in an instance by an announcement from the platform. And so they have started to organize in some instances. And I have a story in the book of how a group of app developers was able to successfully create a campaign that forced Apple to change its decision that was threatening the app developers. And so they are starting to push to be heard and to have voice in the process. And I see here an analogy. There's no historical law to say this is how things must go, but I see here an analogy to how things worked in medieval Europe when these gradually the prospering merchants and burghers, they started to win for themselves a greater and greater say in how the rules that they had to play by were actually being made. And I see that we might be in the beginnings of such a process in the platform economy, because these people, they're realizing that, oh, we need to somehow be heard and protect ourselves from these arbitrary decisions of the princes. We can't do it alone. We have to start organizing.
That's so fascinating. So that parallel, I want to kind of go down that path of it and see where we end up, because as we mentioned before, we're currently also doing democracy assistance and democracy promotion in less developed countries, in low-income countries. Right? And the idea there is that, well, there's pretty much two schools of thought. One, so I'd call the developmentalists, who these Marty Lipset, this idea that, as you grow richer, real democracy happens if power gets dispersed, not if you write it down on a piece of paper, right? And if you look into history, there's Barrington Moore, the real democracy, the real dispersion of power comes from economic power that gets dispersed.
Exactly.
That's why it's hard to promote democracy in oil countries a lot of times, because it's a point source, right? Whoever rules the oil has the power, and then if you want to run up against that power, you're pretty much getting smacked down like the peasant revolutions, right? And that's what you have, these two collective action chapters.
That's right.
One that didn't work because it was data labelers, right? The analogy to peasants, and the other which. I don't necessarily want to say that all of them are more articulate or are more. This upper middle class of
they're more attuned, culturally attuned.
They're engaged
to the mores of the upper class.
They know who to talk to. They know maybe some of the same. So it's a dispersion of power to the middle classes, which from an activist perspective is much less sexy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So this is unfortunately a story in which worker resistance is not being successful so far, and rather what democratization there is coming from the middle class. And I think that, it was pointed to me that there's a wonderful review of the book that's just come out, an LSE review of books. And the author of that review, a brilliant scholar, James Muldoon, he points out that, but the working class was very important in the 18th and 19th centuries to the expansion of democratic rights. And he's totally right, but I would say that the trouble is we're still, on the internet, politically, we're still in the 13th or 14th century, right? So we're still at a stage where the middle class, the privileged few, are fighting to have a voice in decision making and have a share of the power. And once they get there, then comes the 18th and 19th century, if this follows kind of, say, my historical analogy, where then the democratic rights are expanded to a working class. But how does this look like from the perspective of expanding democracy in actual countries?
Well, so
today, not historically.
So it's all moving so much faster, right, on the internet than it did historically. The difference that we have still in the thing that I'm trying to wrap my head around, what's different about cloud empires is that all of them, and with the exception maybe of the data labelers, are all quite well off. I mean, this is not, there's a there's an idea in the modernization theory in Seymour Martin Lipset. There's a certain GDP per capita as of which democracy becomes viable, right?
I see. Mm-hmm.
Which so because people can start thinking, people can start organizing.
Yeah.
I forget the name of the organizer of the
Christy Millan,
yes.
so a virtual labor organizer, brilliant woman. Yeah.
So she herself said this while I was a data labeler, while I was jumping out of the shower because my Amazon bot was ringing.
Yeah.
I didn't have time to organize. Right. Later, I looked back, I could breathe because I had a better job. I had a bit more freedom. Right. That's I think the analogy in the global South today, where in a lot of countries, most people in the countryside are not into. They're worried about what they're going to eat next winter. Not next. Most countries are warm, but they're worried about what they're going to have to eat. Right. So
winning abstract political rights is kind of doesn't make it to their agenda.
Yeah. Who tells me who to vote for, and maybe I get a bit of money for voting for a certain person. That's in a democracy.
That's really fascinating, Elvis. That you see these analogies to the development literature, which you're the expert on, and it seems like they're spot on. The analogies just really work, and this is just stuff that I've discovered through empirical research and my working with my colleagues. This is not something I kind of am. It's one of the things that I'm trying to avoid in this book is doing too much imagining about what might be or what I'm mostly just reporting facts that we've observed, right? And what you're saying is that actually the facts that we're observing in terms of democratization or lack thereof in the platform economy, in cloud empires, seems to have a lot of parallels with kind of historical and development theory models of it, and that's fascinating, I think.
Yeah. Shall we leave it there? Shall we? I'm thinking because I think
we should. You should write a paper about that. Yeah, you can take this and then kind of say, okay, how does this look like from the perspective of development theory? Where does it work? Where does it not? What does it suggest for?
Well, I mean, what we're doing with development theory is we're kind of looking at history. We're looking at Douglas North and the long history. How has it happened in earlier times, right? In Europe, in the offshoots, in East Asia, right? How did democracy and economic development and democracy go hand in hand? So far, the best explanation is, and I mean, there's different opinions out there, is that as countries get richer, they tend to become more democratic, either with a bang at some point or bit by bit, right? Now there are some who say, well, we need to put in place the rules. We need to help put in place the rules, right? The democracy promotion people, and others who say, well, let's create the jobs, and those rules, people will then start. If you create good jobs for middle class people in the cities, that in and of itself is de facto democratization because you're displacing the power, right?
That's fascinating. Yeah.
But I'm still not quite there where we are with cloud empires. Because the burgers you're talking about, they're also fascinating. They're much richer than me, right? These guys are also really well off, and
well, the ones in the story, they are,
okay.
But then you get there's lots of diversity in the middle class, right? So lots of them are not that well off. And diversity is a really characteristic of the platform, kind of like a huge heterogeneity in terms of outcomes is a very characteristic feature. So I think possibly historical middle classes might be more uniform in some ways because there are office jobs, people sitting in rows of desks doing similar administrative tasks, earning similar salaries. So this kind of, in a Marxist sense, they have like not just a shared economic interest, but also perhaps a shared consciousness of their shared interest. Whereas maybe, and this is something to be researched, on platforms, the variety, the heterogeneity of outcomes is greater. You've mentioned the Matthew effect many times. So we have a small number of very, very well-off people on any platform, who are really benefiting from the platform, whether it's app developers or freelancers or merchants, right? They strike it rich. And then we have a long tail of people who kind of never really made it, right? And then maybe people in between. But are there, so maybe this needs further theorizing. It's not quite as simple. But maybe it starts from the top, and maybe this is not too different. Actually, maybe this is not too different from a kind of medieval class structure, where actually the middle class was like tiny in numbers, right? Like today, it's probably by numbers we think in European societies like middle class is by far the biggest. But in medieval societies, it was a tiny number of people, so actually a very small elite.
That's how it is in Africa today.
Right. And so in Africa today, there's this tiny number of people who are demanding some political rights and participation and a voice in decision making. But what it does is that it does turn it from an autocracy into a system of dispersed, not democratic in the sense of everyone having a voice, but to a system which is radically different from autocracy.
All right.
Okay, but hey, we should probably wrap it up there.
Let's wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Vili, for doing this. Thank you for your patience with me, with my technology.
No, thank you, Elvis. I mean, I knew this was going to be a great conversation because you are, obviously we've been talking about things over the years so many times. And, finally I've had a chance to kind of put my thoughts down in a form where I can just give them to you and say, here, let me, I've been unable to explain these things to you before, but here, read this. And I could see that you really understood what I was saying, and you had some fascinating points, actually, how that chimes with your experience and knowledge of development. And I hope we can continue this conversation.
Let's continue it. I have one point for any young people out there listening.
Yeah.
Who are about to spend their inheritance on Bitcoin. You spoke to me about this several times.
Yeah.
And I have to admit I didn't get it. I didn't understand the crux of it until I read that chapter. Even after I watched your Alan Turing talk,
right.
Alan Turing Institute 2016 talk, I watched that. I thought I understood it.
Right.
And afterwards, you're always smarter. You think, oh, why didn't I know that before? Like that was quite straightforward.
Yeah.
But I'm speaking to my earlier self. If there's young people out there hoping to get rich off Bitcoin, thinking it's the way to go, currently it's down. As it's going back up, make sure you get the book just for that chapter. It'll help you down the road just to understand what you're in for, what the implications are.
I think that's right, Elvis. Thank you. I mean, it's self-serving, but I do think people will save themselves a lot of trouble if they learn about this. But hey, thanks, Elvis.
Thank you.
Wonderful conversation. Absolutely great.
Are you kidding me? It wasn't taping.
The whole thing? Yeah.
The phones are taping. Oh.
Well, the phones are taping, yeah. It's not the best, but you've got one here and one there, so it's actually not bad.